The Empathecary Podcast is a Mind Garden Media podcast in association with
Screw You, Todd
Productions.
I can't believe it's episode 9 of the Empathecary Podcast. I'm Sandy.
And how many years are we talking?
Well, we've been doing it for a couple of years, Dave, and, well, Todd is normally where you are right now, but funny story. Todd and I, because you and I, literally, as this episode of the Empathecary is coming out, are in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And Todd and I knew this, and we thought we were so smart, and we planned ahead. And we actually, last weekend, recorded an episode of the Empathecary so that everybody had some content while I was away. And then the file got corrupted.
Oh, boy.
Yep, the file got corrupted. Poor Todd couldn't figure out what the heck happened. And here you and I are, because by the time we were able to record this, Todd couldn't record it. So it's you and me.
Here we are.
Episode 9. And, you know, I thought it would be actually kind of a weird blessing in disguise, because we market this podcast. We say that this podcast, the Empathecary Podcast, is a podcast for and by empaths and the people that love them. And I thought maybe this would be a really cool opportunity for you and I to talk about the fact that you're not an empath, but you've been living with one for like 21 years now. And I only realized that I was an empath about, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And before that, I was just having all these weird experiences that I either couldn't explain or explain them incorrectly. I always blamed maybe my diabetes on the fact that this happened or that happened, and I was hungry and my blood sugar was low. But in fact, it really wasn't. It was the fact that I was an empath who didn't know they were an empath for a long time. And then I was sort of just trying to make sense of what was happening to me when I was around all of this energy, and I couldn't handle it.
So you were overthinking, and you thought you were overthinking, but you really weren't.
Well, kind of, in a weird way. Yeah, well, you know I overthink everything anyways. But, yeah, and weird things would happen to me while we were together. And I just didn't know what it was. There was the time, there were a couple times when we were at concerts. And this was around 2013. We were at the Jason Aldean concert at SPAC, Saratoga Performing Arts Center. And all of a sudden, I just felt really off and really dizzy. And I looked at you and I said, I have to go. I have to get out of here. I have to just go. And you looked at me kind of weird, and we walked around a little bit.
The one at the Turning Stone, I think, was even more obvious, where we just came out of a concert and then just kind of hung around for a little while till you sort of, I don't know if recovered is the word, but just kind of felt okay. It
was weird because I just really felt like all of a sudden, and it wasn't too long into the concert, all of a sudden I just felt really like I couldn't breathe, and like the room was about a foot around me on either side, and that's it. I like almost was claustrophobic, and I was just really not feeling well at all. I was getting dizzy. And that's when I said to you, Dave, I got to get out of here.
Now, what's the difference between those episodes and the ones that you can sort of pinpoint, like when we were at the Utica Psych Center? What's the difference between those?
Well, even then, so long story short, you and I were taking a tour of the Utica Psychiatric Center, which was Old Main. The Old Main, and
which goes back many, many, many years and has been closed for a long time. So there's quite the history to it for those that don't know about it.
And a lot of not so good history about it. And I didn't know. We were taking a tour, and we went into this room, and all of a sudden, as soon as I stepped over the threshold, I just felt panicky, like I couldn't breathe. I just felt really, really claustrophobic almost. And I said, Dave, just get me out of here. And you took me through the other door on the other side of the room. And it wasn't until years later, this was probably 12 or 13 years ago, it wasn't until years later when I realized that I was an empath that I was able to truly make sense of it, because I didn't know. And come to find out, what was going on in that room was when we walked into it, there were a bunch of paintings and drawings in the room, and they were actually paintings and drawings that were done by former patients. And so once I knew I was an empath and I was able to look back on it, I realized that I was taking on those emotions of those patients who had done those paintings. And we all know that energy can be absorbed by an activity or by an object. And I think that that's what really happened.
Yeah, so that's what, for me, is more understandable, especially going through it with you. But again, can you pinpoint and can you figure out the difference between those episodes and then the episodes where we might be going to some place and you say, let's go somewhere else, even if it's just a restaurant or a stop along the way or a store, or again, the examples of the concerts.
How many times have I done that to you over the years? I've
lost track.
I've been so excited to go to a place, and at the last minute, I've just been like, Dave, I can't go. Let's go somewhere else instead. Let's do something else instead. I think that now that I've been aware of it for several years, it's sort of a journey. It's always a work in progress as an empath. But now that I'm aware of it, it's easy to look back on those things and really make sense of what happened. In the moment, though, it's very difficult. So, for example, it's very, very easy for me, and I'm a pretty strong empath. It's very easy for me to pick up on people, the energy that living people give off. There really isn't a big difference between picking up on the energy of an object or the emotional imprint on an object, or the emotions of a person. It really is kind of the same thing. What really makes the difference, though, is once you're aware that you're an empath, being able to, what they call, compartmentalize it. And that means you're learning how to recognize the difference between what you yourself are feeling personally and what you're picking up from other sources. And I say sources to mean people or objects or atmospheres, the air, whatever it happens to be. That's why if I didn't feel right in a store, for example, I would say, let's go. Because it wasn't necessarily the people. It may have been just the atmosphere, the energy in that store, the energy left in that store. So
is that the same thing that happened at the concerts, for example?
I think what happened was there was so much energy because we all have our own energy. You have your own energy, I have mine. And what was happening was because there were so many people in one place at one time, exerting that energy, I was just being bombarded. When we were in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and I had the incident inside the train car. It was a real train car from the Holocaust. And I had that incident, and I'll tell you, I thought I just didn't feel well. I thought that we were overdoing it, but now looking back on it, I realized 100% what was going on. But I think I was just picking up on all of that energy, that sadness, that despair, that confusion, that hopelessness. And there were even artifacts around the car that I think I picked up on. And once I went and sat down and got away from it, distanced myself from it, I started to feel a little bit better. And then we were able to, what I thought was interesting about the Holocaust Museum was, if you remember, there were like 5 floors. And you go up, and I was okay until I got to that one floor with that car on it. And that's where it just hit me. And that was I would almost go so far as to say it was a life-changing experience, because that really was something that I don't think I've ever felt since. I felt like my chest got punched when I walked in. And I didn't know that was a train car. When you first walk in, if you remember, you walk in through it, and it almost looks like a doorway.
Right.
And I didn't realize it until afterwards. And,
yeah, it's a very emotional place. And again, now looking back to the years and the experiences that you had without realizing you were an empath, now you can pinpoint those as to why you felt that way. And then there's the ones that you don't really know why.
No.
Again, I go back to the concerts. You don't really know why, but you can understand why at a place like the Holocaust Museum, why it would have happened, or the Utica Psych Center.
Sure. And even today, now that my other psychic abilities have really leveled up and gotten much stronger. If you remember, we did an investigation a couple of years ago at a home, and it was on some pretty historic property. It was an old 1700s home, and I could feel the land sort of swaying and vibrating. And so that's what it's like. If you're ever for someone who's not an empath, if you're ever in a situation like a ride at the carnival where you kind of go in the fun house or something and the floor kind of slides back and forth, and that's almost what it feels like for me sometimes when I'm picking up that kind of energy. The Native Americans had lived on that land. There was a lot of energy being absorbed into that land, and so I was picking up on it. And so I will say this, not a lot of people think that being an empath is a horrible thing, and I'm not going to argue with that because we all have our own experiences, but I will say that, and first of all, I will say that I'm thankful that you have always not only believed in me, but believed me when these things happened. I've been very fortunate to get your support, but I just find it fascinating, and being able to look back on different events that have happened over the years, psychic abilities aside, and I do believe being an empath is a psychic ability, but the other psychic abilities aside, I think it's really fascinating to look back on these events and be able now, from a different perspective, evaluate what actually happened, because I think it helps you. The closure is not the right word, but I think it helps you move forward.
It's an understanding, because for years you said, I don't really know why I went through this, and I don't know why I went through that. And you were puzzled for many years, and I think you're still a little puzzled about it, but at least you have a little bit of insight into it now. Yeah,
as I go forward with everything, I think one of the good things that's happened is I've embraced it. Instead of hating it, instead of being afraid of it, instead of worrying about things when it comes to it, I've sort of embraced it, and I've really taught myself how to almost turn it off when I need to turn it off and not let it interfere. And it's a lot of work. It's not easy. I'm not 100% there, but I've learned how to kind of keep it sort of like people who work 9 to 5 in the office and they come home and they leave their work at the office. That's me. I try to, whenever possible, compartmentalize what I'm feeling and kind of put it aside and understand that it's not mine. That's not my feelings. And it's easier said than done, because we're going to talk about something in a minute that has been really, really hard this week and last week. But
again, it's an understanding.
Sure.
Just like anything else, you do it enough times, you start to understand it, you start to believe things, and you start to deal with things.
Right. I thought a lot of my life, I thought that I was really depressed, and I had a lot of assumptions about myself growing up that now I look back on. Empath, psychic abilities, now I look back on and I realized that everything I really thought about myself in those negative ways was a misunderstanding. And so now at this point in my life, at 52 years old, and having 6 or 7 years of learning to understand under my belt, I can look back at my childhood, my early adult years, and now I can understand a little bit more why I felt and thought the way I did, the decisions that I made, right or wrong, the decisions that I made were a lot of times based on those kinds of things, So I'm just really grateful to have your support. Has it been really hard for you sometimes? Because sometimes I've been moody or I've been really emotional, and I know that can be kind of awkward and weird. I mean, we've been together 21 years.
No, I think it just goes with the territory. It's just understanding where people are, understanding where they're coming from, understanding what they do, whether it's a hobby or an interest or being an empath. To me, it's all very similar.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I'm very grateful for your support. And before we wrap up this episode, I just wanted to talk really briefly about Maui and everything that's been going on with the fires in Maui. As an empath, and as a person who isn't an empath, it's bad enough to watch or hear about these things. But as an empath, it's extremely difficult. If everybody remembers last year when the war in the Ukraine began, I was having a really hard time. And then just a few months ago, when the wildfires from Canada were blowing the smoke, the winds were blowing the smoke down here to us, I had sort of an epiphany that the smoke was actually carrying some energy. And so I was picking up on the energy of the wildfires and actually the emotions of the animals and the people and the nature. And I was having a really hard time with it. It wasn't just a physical thing in the idea of, be careful if you're breathing. I was having a really hard time with that. And so now the wildfires in Maui have just been really devastating, not only for the poor people who have lived through it, but for anyone who is an empath who might be very sensitive to something like that. And what made it even worse was that you and I went there in 2005 for our honeymoon. We flew to Maui.
Yeah, so then you look back on it and you add to your empath kind of view to your own emotional view, and it's got to be even more. It's devastating for all of us that look through it. And Maui was an incredible visit. That it was the first time in my life that I actually looked out at nothing and I said, look how beautiful it is.
Oh my gosh.
It was just so gorgeous even when we were looking at nothing.
We flew in, we had, if you remember correctly, all those years ago, we had a 10-hour delay in Chicago, at Chicago O'Hare. And we, instead of flying in the afternoon, because I really wanted to fly in the afternoon, so when you fly into Maui, you can see all of the islands at one time. And I was really looking forward to that. And we got delayed for 10 hours, and we arrived at 1 o'clock in the morning. But I will say this, that we stayed at the Four Seasons Wailea, beautiful hotel, absolutely gorgeous resort. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, they were standing there with their leis and their greetings and the Hawaiian spirit at 2 o'clock in the morning waiting for us. And we spent time in Lahaina. We sat under the banyan tree. I have a picture somewhere. We did a submarine tour off the dock in Lahaina. We walked around. We went to a marketplace. And that town is so rich in history and culture. And those people put their heart and soul into that island and that town. And it's just so heartbreaking.
It's just unbelievable to see what it looked like from wars gone by. It's just pretty amazing. And hopefully things can come back.
So what can you do if you are an empath and you're being affected by something like a war or a wildfire or Maui or anything that is strongly affecting you? One of the things I would suggest is, as I said before, compartmentalize. Just first recognize, sit down, meditate, think, be quiet, and learn what is your true emotions, and learn what is the emotions that you're taking on of everyone else. Learn the difference between the two, because I promise you that will make a big difference. And once you can do that, you can start to kind of push those emotions aside. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not a feeling person because you have your own emotions that you're dealing with. But by realizing the difference between the two and pushing them aside, you really can help yourself quite a bit. And really quiet, contemplating, quiet peace, meditation really can do so much for you. It really can. I sit up here in my studio sometimes during the day, and Spike's sleeping in his bed, and I just sit on the floor and I burn some Palo Santo or some sage, and I just sit. I just sit quietly. And it helps, especially when you have anxiety. And I do have some anxiety, and it really does help. So that's the biggest thing I can say to you is to just learn how to be more aware of your emotions versus the emotions that you're taking on.
And you have to do what it takes, whatever it takes, whether you're an empath or not, to get to that point. And if you are an empath, as you said, and it takes a little meditating or a little downtime or a little quiet time or a little solace, then that's what you do. You can't tell somebody that that's not how you do it. There is no right or wrong.
Right, exactly. So, all right, Dave, thank you for joining me.
Todd, please come back next week.
Todd and I will be back next week. So thank you guys for joining us for the Empathecary Podcast, episode number 9. Bye.
Bye.